The needle slipped. It bit deep into Hazel Quinn's finger, a tiny silver snake with a single sharp tooth. She sucked in a breath, a quiet little hiss, not from the pain, but from the fear of the sound. Noise was not tolerated, not from the help, especially not from the woman Mrs. Graves called the overfed spinster behind the curtain, a cruel whisper she thought no one could hear. But Hazel heard everything. She had learned to live in the quiet spaces, to listen to the sounds other people tried to hide. A single drop of blood welled up, fat and red. It landed on the ivory lace of the wedding gown, a perfect crimson tear on a field of white. A stain, another mistake in a life that felt full of them. Outside, the Flagstaff wind howled, throwing handfuls of snow against the shop window like angry ghosts. The little tailoring shop smelled of scorched wool and hot starch, and the bitter, steamy scent of disappointment. It was the smell of other women's dreams. Another gown hung on the dress form, its hem a mess of pins. The bride, a girl no older than 19, had come in yesterday, her voice a trembling whisper. Just don't let the fat one sew it. Please. Hazel had pretended not to hear. Pretending was a skill she'd mastered. She'd learned it at 10, when the schoolyard boys called her a mule in a bonnet. She'd perfected it at 17, when her father tried to sell her off to a merchant to clear his debts, only for the man to take one look at her and laugh. Now, at 32, Hazel Quinn wore shame like other women wore perfume. She bled quietly. She stitched for others. She belonged to no one. "Hazel!" Mrs. Groves barked from the front of the shop, her voice like cracking ice. "Don't you dare botch that lace. It's for Miss Eleanora Price. Her fiancé is a big shot from Denver, and she wants a waist smaller than her ankles." Laughter erupted from the front room, high, light, careless, the sound of girls who had never been hungry, never been lonely, never been told they were not enough. Hazel didn't have to look. She knew their voices. "She should have hired a real seamstress," one of them giggled. "Not someone who looks like she ate the last one," another added, the words sharp as glass. Then the first voice, louder, aiming the words like a stone. "Did you see that flyer on the town board? Some crazy mountain man looking for a wife. Who in their right mind would answer that?" A pause. Then a voice dripping with venom. "Maybe Hazel should. I hear they need bearskin rugs up there. She could keep him warm all winter." The laughter that followed was a tidal wave. It washed over the curtain, soaked into the walls, and crashed into Hazel's chest. Her fingers trembled, but she did not cry. Crying was a luxury she'd given up long ago. But inside her, something she thought had turned to stone finally cracked. Her hand slipped into her apron pocket, her fingers closing around a folded, smudged piece of paper. The flyer. She had taken it down 3 days ago, hiding it like a secret sin, seeking a woman unafraid of cold, silence, or honest work. A warm hearth and shared purpose await. SG. No promises of love, no mention of beauty, just warmth, just purpose. 2 things no one had ever offered Hazel Quinn. She looked at the blood on the pristine lace, a tiny, permanent flaw, a mark of her failure. Slowly, carefully, she put the needle down. She stood up. Her knees felt stiff. She untied her apron, the one stained with the blood of 1,000 tiny wounds, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. She took her worn wool coat from the peg on the wall and buttoned it up. Her hands, for the first time all day, were perfectly steady. She walked through the front room, past the laughing girls and the disapproving glare of Mrs. Greaves. She didn't look at them. She didn't say a word. She could feel their eyes on her back as the bell above the door chimed, a tinny little sound of freedom. The cold wind slapped her face, and it felt like a baptism. It was the last time she would ever walk down that street as someone else's shadow. She didn't know it yet, but she was walking toward a mountain, and that mountain was hiding a secret far darker than a simple, lonely man. She packed in less than 10 minutes. There wasn't much to pack. 2 plain dresses, a Bible with her mother's name in faded ink, and the small velvet pouch that held her only inheritance, a silver thimble. She tucked the creased flyer into her satchel as if it were a holy relic. By sundown, she was standing in the supply yard, the wind whipping her hair across her face. The weekly delivery wagon to Whitmore Ridge was being loaded, its driver a gnarled old man with suspicion etched into every line on his face. "Whitmore Ridge?" he grunted, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Ain't nothing up there but ice and trouble. The trail washes out at the fork. You sure, missus?" "I'm sure," Hazel said, her chin held high. "I'll walk the rest of the way." He looked her up and down, plump, pale, and with a fire in her eyes he hadn't expected. "Suit yourself," he muttered, shaking his head. "But ain't no one gonna come back for you if you change your mind. They say the fella up there. They say he ain't right in the head, that his last woman just vanished." Hazel's blood ran cold for a second. Vanished. The word hung in the icy air. But what did she have to lose? A life of being invisible. She was already a ghost. "I won't change my mind," she said. She climbed into the back of the wagon, her satchel clutched to her chest like a shield. She didn't look back as the lights of Flagstaff disappeared into the swirling snow. There was nothing for her there but insults and unfinished dresses. Ahead of her, the world was a sea of white. The pines stood like silent, judgmental sentinels, and the wind screamed a warning. But Hazel Quinn didn't care. For the first time in her life, she wasn't running from something. She was walking towards it. She had no idea that the man waiting on that mountain wasn't just lonely. He was hiding. And the thing he was hiding from was far worse than a harsh winter. The road disappeared 2 hours before dawn. The wagon driver stopped just as he'd promised. "This is it," he said, not even looking at her. "Trail's no place for a wagon from here on out. Good luck. You'll need it." Hazel stepped down into the snow. It came up to her calves, cold and wet, seeping instantly into her worn leather boots. The wagon creaked away, its sound swallowed by the immense silence of the forest, leaving her utterly alone. But she didn't hesitate, 1 foot in front of the other. That was the only rule. The trail was a faint suggestion, a winding path through trees heavy with snow. Their branches groaned under the weight, the sound like old bones breaking. Her lungs burned with every breath, and her toes were numb, but she kept moving. She was fueled by 32 years of quiet desperation. The sun was a pale smear in the morning sky when she finally saw it. Nestled between 2 giant boulders was a cabin. It was built of thick, dark timber and stone, solid and uninviting. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, the only sign of life. Hazel stopped at the edge of the clearing, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the point of no return. She walked across the clearing, her boots crunching in the snow. 3 wooden steps led to a porch. She climbed them, the wood creaking a loud protest in the stillness. She raised a gloved hand and knocked twice. The sound was shockingly loud, and then it was gone, eaten by the woods. Silence. A full minute passed. She was about to turn away, to admit defeat, when the door groaned open. A man filled the frame. He was a giant, taller than the door, broader than a bear. He had to duck his head to look out. His beard was thick and dark. His jaw was a slab of granite, and his eyes were the color of a winter storm, and they watched her with a stillness that was deeply unsettling. He wasn't just looking at her. He was assessing her, weighing her. Hazel held up the flyer, her hand shaking slightly. You posted this?" His eyes flickered from the paper to her face, then down to her snow-soaked boots. He gave a single, slow nod. "I'm Hazel Quinn," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I can sew, I can cook, I work hard, and I don't complain." The giant of a man stepped back, pulling the door open wider. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. "Come in." The warmth of the cabin hit her first. It smelled of pine and smoke and something else, something faintly metallic, like old iron or old blood. The inside was one large room. It was sparse and brutally functional, No curtains, no rugs, no softness. But it was clean. A stack of chopped wood by the stove, a row of tools hanging on the wall, a single bed in the corner. This was the home of a man who lived utterly alone. A kettle hissed on the stove. Without a word, the man poured hot water into a tin cup, added a pinch of tea leaves, and set it on the rough wooden table. Then he leaned against the far wall, his massive arms crossed over his chest, and just watched her. Hazel wrapped her frozen fingers around the warm cup. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. "You live here alone?" she finally asked. "I do," he rumbled. "Were you expecting anyone else to answer your flyer?" "No." The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't an answer. It was a statement of fact. She took a sip of the tea. It was strong, earthy, and it warmed her from the inside out. "I can stay for one night," she said, meeting his gaze. "If it doesn't seem like a fit, I'll be on my way in the morning." He tilted his head, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "You'll stay the night," he said. "And if tomorrow you decide I'm not a fit, I'll walk you down the mountain myself." Hazel blinked. He had twisted her words, putting the power of the decision in her hands. It was the last thing she expected. It disarmed her completely. "What's your name?" she asked. "Silas." He didn't offer a last name. He showed her to a small, windowless room at the back of the cabin. It was barely a closet, with a narrow cot and a single wool blanket. "It's clean," he said, then left her alone. Hazel sat on the edge of the cot, her body aching. She looked at herself in the small, cracked piece of mirror hanging on the wall. Wind-burned cheeks, tangled hair, broad shoulders. She looked like a survivor. For the first time, that felt like enough. But as she lay under the heavy blanket later that night, listening to the wind howl outside, she heard another sound. A sound from the main room. Creak. Scrape. It was the sound of a floorboard being pried loose. Hazel held her breath, her blood turning to ice. The wagon driver's words came back to her. His last woman just vanished. What had she walked into? What was this man hiding under the floor of his isolated cabin? She lay there in the dark, heart pounding, and knew one thing for sure. This was not a story about a lonely man looking for a wife. This was a story about a man with a secret, and she was trapped on the mountain with him. The next morning, the cabin was filled with the smell of baking bread. Hazel had barely slept, her mind racing with terrifying possibilities. She emerged from her small room to find Silas by the stove, his back to her, his massive shoulders blocking the light from the window. A fresh loaf of bread sat steaming on the counter. He was a monster who baked. The thought was so absurd it almost made her laugh. "You're up," he rumbled, not turning around. "There's coffee on the stove." She poured a cup, her hands shaking. She thought about the floorboard, about the scraping sound. She had to know. "I'd like to earn my keep," she said, her voice a little too loud. "Is there anything that needs mending?" He grunted, nodding towards a wooden crate by the hearth. "In there. Shirts mostly. Most are beyond repair." While he went outside to chop wood, his axe strokes echoing through the silent forest, Hazel went to the crate. But her eyes were fixed on the floor in front of the hearth. She found it instantly. One board was slightly askew, the nailheads fresh and shiny. Her heart pounded. This was insane. She should run. She should grab her satchel and flee back down the mountain. But where would she go? Back to the laughter and the insults? Back to being nothing? No. Her curiosity, for the first time in her life, was stronger than her fear. With her eyes darting towards the door, she knelt down. Using the tip of her sewing shears, she worked the board loose. It came up with a soft groan. Underneath, nestled in the dark, cool earth, was a small, locked wooden box. It was old, the wood dark with age, bound with iron straps. Her breath caught in her throat. What was inside? Money? A weapon? Bones? She heard the crunch of his boots in the snow outside. He was coming back. Panic seized her. She shoved the box back into its hiding place, fumbled the floorboard back into position, and kicked dirt over the edges to hide the seam. She was on her feet, her back to the hearth, just as the door creaked open. Silas entered, his arms full of firewood. He stopped and looked at her. His eyes narrowed. "You're pale," he said. "I'm just not used to the mountain air," she stammered. He didn't look convinced. He dropped the wood into the box with a crash, the sound making her jump. He watched her for a long moment, then seemed to let it go. But Hazel knew he was suspicious, and she was a terrible liar. The day passed in a thick, unbearable tension. She sat by the fire mending his torn flannel shirts, her hands moving on autopilot. Her mind was on the box, on the secret it held. On one of the shirts, she found a dark, stiff stain near the collar. She scraped at it with her fingernail. "What's this stain?" she asked, holding it up. He glanced over. "Pine sap," he said, his voice flat. He went back to sharpening a knife, the shing, shing, shing of steel on stone setting her teeth on edge. It didn't look like pine sap. That evening, as he was outside tending to whatever small animals he kept, Hazel's eyes scanned the room. She was looking for a key. She was a woman possessed. On the mantelpiece, tucked behind a block of wood, she saw it. A small, simple iron key, tarnished with age. Her hand trembled as she took it. It had to be the one. She knew it. She waited until the cabin was dark and quiet, until she could hear the slow, deep rhythm of his breathing from his bed in the far corner. The moon cast long shadows across the floor. Holding her breath, she crept from her room. The floorboards creaked under her weight. She froze, listening. He didn't stir. She knelt by the hearth again, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She lifted the board, her fingers closing around the cold iron of the box. She pulled it out. The key fit. She turned it. The lock clicked, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the silent cabin. She lifted the lid. Inside, there was no gold, no gun. There was only a single object, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, a silver locket intricately carved with vines and leaves. It was beautiful, expensive. It did not belong in this rough, brutal place. With trembling fingers, she opened it. 2 tiny portraits were inside. On one side, a younger, clean-shaven Silas. On the other, a beautiful young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Hazel's blood ran cold. This wasn't his mother. This was a lover, a wife. She turned the locket over. There was an inscription on the back, the letters small and elegant. "My dearest Alara, forever." The wagon driver's words echoed in her mind. His last woman just vanished. Who was Alara, and where was she now? Hazel looked over at the sleeping form of the giant in the corner. He wasn't just a man with a secret. He was a man with a past that had a name, and Hazel was sleeping in her room. The next morning, the silence in the cabin was a weapon. Hazel couldn't eat. She couldn't sew. The silver locket felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket. The image of the smiling woman, Alara, was seared into her mind. Silas seemed to sense the change. He watched her, his storm-colored eyes missing nothing. The comfortable quiet they had briefly shared was gone, replaced by a thick fog of suspicion. She couldn't stand it anymore. She waited until he was sitting at the table, mending a piece of leather tack. She walked over, pulled the locket from her pocket, and placed it on the table between them. It landed with a soft, metallic click. "Who was she?" Hazel asked, her voice a whisper. Silas froze. His hands stilled. He looked down at the locket, and his face became a mask of stone. Every ounce of warmth, of humanity, drained out of him. He looked like the monster she had first feared him to be. He was silent for a long, long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Finally, he looked up at her. His eyes were dark, haunted pits. "Her name was Alara," he said, his voice a low, painful rasp. "What happened to her?" Hazel pressed, her heart pounding. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered trees outside the window. "She was the reason I came to this mountain," he said, his words slow and heavy, as if he were pulling them up from a deep, dark well. "And she is the reason I can never leave." The words hung in the air, filled with a terrible, unspoken meaning. "The town," Hazel whispered, the pieces clicking together in her mind. "The wagon driver. They think you did something to her, don't they?" Silas didn't answer. He didn't have to. The guilt radiated off him in waves. He just stared out at the endless, unforgiving forest, the place where a woman named Alara had vanished. He didn't confess to anything, but in his silence, Hazel heard everything she needed to know. He was protecting a secret, a deadly one. He explained, his voice hollow, that Alara was his love. They were going to build a life in this very cabin, away from the world. But one day, while walking the trail up to meet him, there had been an accident. A fall. No one ever found her, he finished, his voice breaking on the last word. Hazel felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by a cold dread. The story was too simple, too neat. A few days passed in a state of armed truce. They spoke only when necessary. Hazel found herself watching his hands, the way they could be so gentle with dough and so brutal with an axe. She thought about Alara, about her pretty, smiling face. One afternoon, desperate for a distraction, she decided to clean out a dusty, neglected corner of the small barn. Behind a stack of rotting feed sacks, she found a pile of old newspapers, used as insulation against the cold. She was about to toss them into the fire when a headline, stark and black, caught her eye. It was from a Flagstaff paper, dated 2 years ago. Railroad heir questioned in disappearance of local woman. Her blood turned to ice. She read the article, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the brittle paper. It detailed the story of a wealthy heir who had run off to the mountains, and the local girl, Alara, who had followed him and then vanished without a trace. The authorities had questioned him, but the investigation was mysteriously dropped. And then she saw the drawing, a police sketch of the heir. It was a younger, clean-shaven Silas, but the name printed beneath it wasn't Silas Granger. It was Silas Granger Whitmore. He hadn't just lied to her about Alara. He had lied about everything. He wasn't some simple mountain man. He was the fugitive heir to the Granger-Whitmore railroad fortune, a man who had used his family's power to make a murder investigation disappear. She ran back to the cabin, the newspaper clutched in her hand. She burst through the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She threw the paper onto the table. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling with rage and fear. He looked at the headline, and all the fight went out of him. He sank into a chair, his massive frame seeming to shrink. "I walked away from that name," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I walked away from the money, the power, my father, all of it. I took my mother's name, Granger. I just wanted to be left alone." "You didn't just walk away!" Hazel cried. "You buried a girl on this mountain and used your family's money to get away with it." "No!" he roared, slamming his fist on the table, the wood groaning in protest. He stood up, his eyes blazing with a pain so deep it shocked her into silence. "I didn't hurt her. I loved her." His voice dropped, becoming raw with grief. "But my family's name, my father's power, that's what killed her." Before Hazel could ask what he meant, they heard a sound from outside, the sound of a horse moving fast. A rider was approaching the cabin. Not a settler, not a local. He was a man in a clean, dark suit, riding a horse far too fine for these rugged trails. He stopped in the clearing and dismounted, his movements crisp and efficient. He walked to the door and handed Silas a sealed envelope. "A message, Mr. Whitmore," the man said, his voice cold and impersonal. "From your sister. Margot Whitmore is in Flagstaff. She demands your presence." The past hadn't just found him. It had sent an emissary. Silas stared at the envelope as if it were a coiled snake. "Don't let her come here," Hazel pleaded, her fear suddenly shifting. This was bigger than a missing girl. This was about power, money, and a family that seemed to devour everything it touched. Silas looked up from the letter, his face grim, his eyes fixed on something over her shoulder. "It's too late for that," he said. Hazel turned. A fine black carriage pulled by 2 matching horses was just now pulling into the clearing. It was the kind of carriage that belonged on the streets of Denver or San Francisco, not on a forgotten mountain trail. It was an invasion. The door of the carriage opened, and a woman stepped out. She was tall and impossibly thin, wrapped in a forest green coat trimmed with black sable fur. Her blonde hair was swept into a perfect, elaborate twist that defied the mountain wind. She carried no luggage, only a pair of expensive leather gloves, which she clutched in one hand like a weapon. She was the absolute opposite of Hazel. She was the opposite of the entire mountain. She was a creature of steel and glass set down in a world of wood and stone. She glided towards the cabin, her boots barely making a mark in the snow. Her eyes, the color of pale ice, were fixed on Silas. She completely ignored Hazel, as if she were a piece of furniture. "Hello, Silas," she said, her voice smooth and cold as a river stone. "It's been a while." "Margot," Silas said, his voice tight. He stood in the doorway, blocking her path. She didn't wait for an invitation. She simply stepped around him and into the cabin, her gaze sweeping across the rough room with a look of undisguised contempt. Her eyes finally landed on Hazel, and a small, cruel smile touched her lips. "And you must be the mail-order bride," she said. "Charming." "What do you want, Margot?" Silas demanded. "Father is dead," she announced, as if she were discussing the weather. "And you, dear brother, have made a terrible mess." She turned, her movements sharp and precise. "The company is expanding, a new rail line, our most ambitious project yet, and this miserable little patch of forgotten land you're squatting on is the only thing standing in our way." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to inform you. You will sign the deed over to the company, immediately." "And if I don't?" Silas challenged, his jaw tight. Margot's smile widened, but it held no warmth. "Then we will take it, and we will dig up every single secret you have buried on this mountain, starting with your little peasant girl, Ilara. We will paint you as a monster, a murderer. The newspapers will have a field day. We will ruin you, Silas, utterly." She took a step closer to Hazel, her icy eyes boring into her. "And we will make sure this one," she said, gesturing with her glove, "vanishes, just like the last." It was a direct threat, cold, calculated, and utterly terrifying. "Get off my land," Silas growled, stepping between them, shielding Hazel with his body. Margot let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Silas," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "You poor sentimental fool. You still don't understand, do you?" She tossed a folio of legal documents onto the table. "It's not your land. It's been the company's for years. You're just a squatter, and your time is up." She turned and glided out of the cabin, her final words hanging in the air like poison. "You have 48 hours to sign, or we will simply bulldoze you off it." The carriage door slammed shut. The horses pulled away, leaving a sudden, shocking silence in their wake. Hazel and Silas were left standing in the center of the room, the legal documents sitting on the table like a death sentence. He wasn't a murderer hiding from the law. He was a prince who had run away from his kingdom, and now the kingdom had come to reclaim its own. Hazel looked at the papers, then at Silas's pale, stricken face. He thought he had escaped, but the Whitmore family didn't allow escapes. They only collected debts, and they had come to collect their brother. "What did she mean?" Hazel whispered. "How can it not be your land?" Silas stared at the documents, his face a mask of disbelief. "I don't know. They were trapped, and the monster wasn't the man standing beside her. It was the family he had tried to flee." Panic was a cold, sharp thing in Silas's eyes. He paced the cabin like a caged bear, his fists clenched, his mind reeling from Margot's revelation. Hazel, however, was calm. Years of meticulous stitching, of focusing on tiny, perfect details while the world around her was chaos, had trained her for this. While Silas saw the threat, Hazel saw the stitches. She sat down at the table and opened the folio. The legal jargon was dense, designed to confuse and intimidate. But Hazel read it slowly, her finger tracing each line. It was like following a complex sewing pattern. And then she found it. A clause buried deep in a trust document established by their father. Upon his death, any and all abandoned properties held by his heirs would automatically revert to a holding company controlled by the Whitmore board. By refusing to claim his inheritance, by living as Silas Granger, he had legally abandoned his claim. Margot was right. He was a squatter on his own land. She didn't lie, Hazel said quietly. The deed isn't in your name anymore. Silas stopped pacing, the fight draining out of him. Then it's over, he said, his voice hollow. They've won. No, Hazel said, a spark igniting in her eyes. She kept reading. They took the land, but they didn't take everything. She pointed to another page, a list of assets. You still have your shares, your voting shares in the company. You never sold them. You never transferred them. You just ignored them. Silas stared at her blankly. What good are shares? It's not enough to outvote the entire board. You don't have to outvote them, Hazel said, the idea blooming in her mind, sharp and clear. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It was perfect. You just have to be smarter than them. Margot said this land was in the way of their most ambitious project. Why? What's so special about this ridge? Silas thought for a moment. Water, he said. The North Creek. It's the only year-round water source in a 50-mile radius. A steam engine railroad needs millions of gallons of water. And who owns the land around North Creek? Hazel pressed. It's Ute land, Silas said. Tribal territory, legally protected. The company has been trying to get their hands on it for a decade. Hazel leaned forward, her eyes blazing. Then that's what we do. We don't fight them for this little cabin. We fight them for the whole damn railroad. She laid out the plan. It was a masterstroke of guerrilla warfare fought on paper. He would use his shares, not to vote against Margot, but to make a legal transfer. He would transfer the full ownership of his remaining assets, a vast, untouched portfolio of land grants his father had acquired, directly to the Ute tribe. Specifically, all the land surrounding North Creek. He wouldn't be giving them money. He would be giving them the one thing the railroad desperately needed. He would be giving them a weapon. It was an act of corporate treason, a poison pill slipped into the heart of the Whitmore Empire. Silas stared at her, his shock slowly turning into a slow, dangerous smile. It was the first real smile she had ever seen on his face. They'll be ruined, he breathed. Yes, Hazel said, her voice steady as steel. They will. The race was on. They had less than 48 hours before Margot's eviction order was finalized. They had to get to the company lawyer in Flagstaff, a man named Burke, who Hazel had read was loyal to Silas's mother, before Margot could stop them. They rode together, pushing their horses hard through the snow-choked trails. The world was a blur of white and gray. Every snap of a twig, every shadow in the trees made them jump. They knew Margot would not let this go. She would have men watching. They reached Flagstaff just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. They galloped down the main street, their horses heaving, and skidded to a stop in front of the lawyer's office, and their hearts sank. Parked right in front of the building was Margot's fine black carriage. They were too late. Without a word, they burst through the door of the office. Margot was standing there, a smug, triumphant smile on her face. A stack of papers sat on the desk in front of a tired-looking elderly lawyer. It's done, Silas, Margot said, her voice like silk. The eviction is filed. The ridge is ours. But the lawyer, Mr. Burke, looked up over his spectacles, first at Margot, then at Silas. A faint, knowing look was in his eyes. Not quite, Miss Whitmore, he said, his voice dry as dust. An eviction notice requires a 24-hour processing period to be official. He turned his gaze to Silas. A direct share transfer, however, is instantaneous upon the heir's signature. He pushed a clean sheet of paper and a pen across the desk towards Silas. What are your instructions, Mr. Whitmore? The room was silent. Margot's face had gone from triumphant to horrified. She saw what was about to happen. Silas looked at Hazel. She gave him a single sharp nod. He picked up the pen. His hand, the same hand that could split a log with one blow, moved with a grace and precision that made Hazel's breath catch. He signed his name, Silas Granger Whitmore, with a bold, defiant flourish. Transfer everything, he said to Burke, his voice clear and strong. All of it, to the Ute Tribal Council, effective immediately. The sound that came out of Margot's throat was not a word. It was a raw, guttural hiss of pure fury. She lunged across the desk, her manicured nails reaching for the paper. But Burke was faster. He snatched it away, blotted the ink, and stamped it with his official seal. Thump! It was the sound of an empire falling. They rode back to the ridge under the cold light of the moon, not with triumph, but with a grim sense of foreboding. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. An animal is most dangerous when it's wounded, and they had just crippled the Whitmore Empire. The news traveled through the mountains like a wildfire. The railroad's great expansion had been stopped dead in its tracks. The Ute tribe now controlled the water rights, the lifeblood of the entire project. But their victory had an immediate, violent consequence. The railroad had promised work. It had promised prosperity. A whole community of desperate settlers on the north side of the ridge had been counting on it. Now, that hope was gone, and they needed someone to blame. They blamed the Ute, and they blamed the mysterious recluse on the ridge who had helped them. 3 nights after they returned from Flagstaff, they woke to the smell of smoke and the angry orange glow of fire against the sky. From their porch, they could see it, a pillar of fire rising from the direction of the settlers' homesteads. One of the Ute grazing cabins had been torched, a message written in flames. The next morning, a note was pinned to their door with a hunting knife. The blade was still quivering. "We know who you are, Whitmore. This isn't over." The fragile peace of the mountains had been shattered. The settlers, led by a hard, angry man named Colby Hayes, were forming a militia. The Ute warriors were gathering in their camps, their faces grim. Blood was in the air. A meeting was called, a neutral ground, a meadow between the territories. The Ute elders would be there. Colby Hayes and his men would be there, and they both demanded the presence of one man, Silas Whitmore. He was the one who had started this. He was the one who had to fix it. "You can't go," Hazel said, her hand on his arm. "They'll kill you." "If I don't go, they'll kill each other," he said, his face set. "This is my fault, my family's legacy. I have to face it." Hazel looked at the knife mark on their door. She looked at the hardened resolve in his eyes. He wasn't running anymore. "Then I'm coming with you," she said, her voice firm. "They threatened me too. This is my fight now." The meadow was thick with tension. On one side stood a dozen settlers armed with rifles and righteous fury. Colby Hayes stood at their head, his face a thundercloud. On the other side stood the Ute elders wrapped in blankets, their faces carved from ancient stone. Silas and Hazel walked into the middle, alone. "You!" Colby Hayes spat, his finger pointing at Silas. "You and your railroad money. You think you can play God with our lives?" "This isn't about money," Silas said calmly. "The hell it isn't," Colby shouted. And then he revealed a truth that hit Silas like a physical blow. "You talk about justice. Your father's railroad, the great Granger-Whitmore line, it promised my family work back east. Then it pulled out, left us with nothing. We came out here crawling through the mud to build something for ourselves, a new start. And you, a Whitmore, you're the one who just took it all away again." The conflict wasn't just about land. It was about a history of pain, a cycle of betrayal, and it was all landing at Silas's feet. The accusation hung in the air. Colby's men raised their rifles. The Ute warriors reached for their knives. The meadow was about to become a battlefield. Colby took a step forward, his eyes burning with hatred. "You're no better than your father. A liar, a coward, a murderer!" He was shouting now, whipping his men into a frenzy. "Everyone knows what you did to that girl. You killed Alara." The accusation hit the clearing like a lightning strike. The air crackled. Violence was seconds away. Just as a shot was about to be fired, a new voice spoke. It was quiet, but it cut through the anger like a sharp blade. It was one of the Ute elders. A very old woman, her face a road map of wrinkles, her eyes holding the wisdom of 100 winters. She looked directly at Silas, but her words were for everyone. "The mountain did not take that girl," she said, her voice clear and steady. Everyone froze. Even Colby Hayes fell silent. The old woman took a slow step forward. A man in a suit did. The silence in the meadow was now absolute. "We saw it," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "My sister and I. We were gathering herbs on the high trail. We saw him with the girl. He was shouting, angry. He said her name, Alara. He told her she would ruin the family, that she was nothing." She paused, her dark eyes finding Silas's again. "He pushed her," the old woman said. "She fought back. He pushed her again, and she fell." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Silas stared at her, his mind reeling. A man in a suit. He remembered. His father, furious about his plans to marry a common girl, had sent a man to the ridge, a fixer, a corporate lawyer who handled the family's dirty work. He was supposed to offer her money to scare her off. Silas had always thought Ilara had just taken the money and left, her heart broken. He never imagined. The Ute woman described the man, short, bald, with a cruel mouth. Silas knew exactly who she was talking about. It was his father's right-hand man, the man who had cleaned up every scandal, buried every secret, for 30 years. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. His father hadn't just disapproved, he had ordered her murder to protect the Whitmore name. Silas's entire life on this mountain, his guilt, his exile, his pain, it was all built on a monstrous, calculated lie. He wasn't a monster, he was a pawn in his father's brutal game. The revelation was so profound, so shocking, that it broke the tension in the meadow. The raw truth of it settled over everyone. Colby Hayes lowered his rifle, his face a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. He wasn't looking at an enemy anymore. He was looking at another victim of the Whitmore legacy. A fragile, unspoken truce began to form. But just as a path to peace seemed possible, a new threat emerged from the trees. It was Margot, and she wasn't alone. She strode into the meadow flanked by two large, thuggish-looking men. Her face was a mask of cold fury. She had clearly been listening from the woods. "Touching stories," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But the ramblings of a senile old woman are not evidence." She held up a piece of paper. "This, however, is a signed affidavit from the man in question. He confesses under oath that he was hired to dispose of the girl, hired by his desperate, love-sick employer." She looked directly at Silas, her eyes glittering with triumph. "Hired by you, brother." She was framing him. If she couldn't have the land, she would have her revenge. She would see him hang. "You're coming with us, Silas," she snarled, "one way or another." The two thugs moved towards him. Colby Hayes and his men were frozen, unsure of what to believe. The Ute were outnumbered. It was over. But Margot had made one fatal miscalculation. She had forgotten about Hazel Quinn. The whole time, Hazel had been standing just behind Silas, silent and watchful. She was no longer the timid seamstress from Flagstaff. She was a woman of the mountain now, hardened, resilient, and fiercely protective. As the two men grabbed for Silas's arms, Hazel moved. She wasn't armed with a rifle or a knife. She was armed with her mind, and with the one thing that had been her constant companion through this entire ordeal, her sewing. For weeks, she had been working on a project, a patchwork quilt pieced together from scraps, the heavy wool from Silas's old shirts, the sturdy burlap from the feed sacks in the barn, the tough denim she had traded for in town. It was large, and it was heavy. She grabbed the quilt from where she'd laid it, and with a strength born of pure desperation, she flung it. It billowed out like a massive, clumsy net and landed squarely over the heads of Margot's two thugs. They were instantly blinded, tangled in the heavy fabric, stumbling and cursing. In that single moment of confusion, everything changed. Silas, freed for an instant, drove his elbow back into the stomach of one man. The other, still flailing under the quilt, was met with the full force of Hazel's cast-iron skillet, which she had carried from the cabin and now swung with surprising ferocity. The clang echoed across the meadow. The standoff was broken. A chaotic brawl erupted. Silas was strong, a mountain of a man, but it was still 2 against 1. He fought with a wild, desperate energy, but the thugs were professionals. They recovered quickly, one of them pulling a pistol. He leveled it at Silas's chest. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, the door of the cabin burst open. It was Colby Hayes. He had seen the truth in Silas's eyes, the lies in Margot's. He had made a choice. He and 2 of his settlers stood there, rifles raised and aimed squarely at Margot's men. "Drop it," Colby commanded, his voice ringing with newfound authority. Margot stared, her perfect plan crumbling into dust around her. She was cornered. "You have no proof!" she shrieked, her voice thin and ragged. "It's his word against mine! We are the proof." The Ute elder stepped forward from the trees, followed by a dozen silent, resolute warriors. They had not been idle. They had circled around, flanking the clearing. "We will testify," the old woman said, her voice resonating with the weight of truth. "We will tell the law what we saw, all those years ago." Margot's face went white. It was over, completely and utterly over. She made a desperate run for the trees. But Colby's men were there, blocking her path. There was no escape. The law came. Margot and her hired thugs were taken into custody. The false affidavit was exposed. With the testimony of the Ute elders, the cold case of Alara's death was reopened. The investigation now focused on the dark legacy of the late Mr. Whitmore and his corporate fixer. The Granger-Whitmore empire, already financially crippled by Silas's masterstroke, was now engulfed in a scandal from which it would never recover. The name was no longer a symbol of power. It was a symbol of murder and corruption. It was ruined. In the quiet aftermath, Silas stood in the meadow, the afternoon sun on his face. He was no longer Silas Whitmore, the fugitive heir, or Silas Granger, the lonely recluse. He was just Silas, a man standing in the light. He was free. The ghosts that had haunted him for years were finally gone. He turned and looked at Hazel. She stood by the porch, the heavy patchwork quilt draped over her arm, her face smudged with dirt, her hair a mess. She had never looked more beautiful. Spring came to the ridge that year, not as a season, but as a promise fulfilled. The snow melted, revealing the rich, dark earth beneath. The creek swelled with fresh water, and the aspens began to bud. The peace in the valley was a fragile thing, but it was real. Forged in conflict, the settlers and the Ute, led by Colby and the elders, began to work together, managing the land trust as partners. They were no longer enemies. They were neighbors. The cabin on the ridge became a home. Silas built a new, sturdy porch. Hazel planted a garden with onions, carrots, and the wildflowers she found growing by the creek. She hung new curtains in the windows, a bright, cheerful green, the color of new life. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Burke, the lawyer. The last of the Whitmore assets had been liquidated. The Denver estate, the family mansion, all of it was gone. He included a bank draft for Silas's final share. It was a fortune. Silas looked at the number, a string of zeros that could buy him anything in the world. He folded the check, put it in an envelope with a short, simple letter, and gave it to the mail rider. Hazel found the receipt on the table later. He had deposited the entire amount into the community land trust. He hadn't kept a single dime. "You gave it all away," she murmured that evening, her hand on his cheek. "It was never mine," he said, his voice quiet but sure. He looked at her, his eyes clear and calm. "None of that ever made me happy. I just wanted to be a man I could respect." "And are you?" she asked softly. He pulled her closer, his large hand covering hers. "I am," he said, "when I'm with you." Life settled into a simple, beautiful rhythm, the hard work of the days, the quiet peace of the evenings. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast, dark sky, Hazel felt a flutter deep inside her, a tiny, secret movement. She smiled and placed Silas's hand on her belly. He looked at her, confused for a moment, and then his eyes widened, a look of pure, unadulterated joy dawning on his face. A year later, Hazel sat in a rocking chair on that same porch, nursing their baby daughter, a beautiful, healthy girl they named Alara. Silas sat beside her, whittling a small wooden bird. Draped across their laps was the quilt. It was no longer just a collection of scraps. It was a map, a story. There was the square from Hazel's old apron, a reminder of the life she'd fled. There was the worn flannel from Silas's shirt, smelling faintly of pine smoke and freedom. There was a strip of deep red cloth, a gift from the Ute women, woven with symbols of strength. And there was a tough square of denim, given to her by Colby Hayes' wife. It was a story of how two broken people, thrown away by the world, had pieced together a future. How a single quiet act of defiance could unravel an empire. How the threads of community, woven together with trust and forgiveness, could create something stronger than steel and more valuable than any fortune. They say a single thread is weak, but enough threads, woven together, can build a fortress. Hazel Quinn and Silas Whitmore proved that the things the world discards, forgotten people, unwanted land, buried truths, can be stitched together to create a strength no power can break and no money can buy. Their life wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. And it was theirs. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of the hidden corners of history, where the most incredible stories are always waiting to be found.